right, it is that time. It's been a long college football year, but despite all the bowl games, the regular season, the upsets, the crazy plays, there's one game left. There's actually two, but society doesn't let me talk South Dakota State. That's another show for another time. The national championship is upon us, TCU and Georgia. We are here to give you kind of that first look. We're going to have plenty of content leading up to the game. But come on now, betting you, we had to close the season out in style. I'm Ben Reza. That is Matt Kajeski. And what a game that we have. We're going to talk about each side, our favorite bets, player props, everything in between. Is this, I just want to ask you right off the top, is this the matchup that you wanted?
I mean, I wanted TCU in for sure. And in the other game, I didn't have a huge preference one way or the other. I had money on Ohio State. I believe you had the money line. I didn't quite get that crazy. But I think Ohio State would have made for a more exciting game from a viewer perspective. I mean, people want points, and Ohio State's certainly going to put them up. Georgia, they can put them up too, but I don't think you're going to see quite as many offensive fireworks, maybe compared to what Ohio State would have done. But I can't complain with the matchup. Georgia's an awesome team. TCU's an awesome team. I honestly would have been happy any combination of these four teams if they had made the final. They're four really good teams, and there's a lot of parity in the playoff this year, which luckily made for two awesome semifinal games, which we haven't really seen in the past.
Couldn't agree more. If I could have chosen my matchup, it would have been TCU and Ohio State. Part of that's monetary. Had Ohio State money line. Really believed that they were going to win that game. And I thought they should have, but for Ryan Day and Harrison, just a lot of things happened. And Georgia is a fantastic opponent, so you can't be too upset about it. Of course, we're going to look at everything for this game. I do want to look backwards just for a few minutes, if we can. A couple guys got banged up. You were talking to me before the show, but even just general thoughts. I mean, TCU, I'm not going to say it was fluky, but they did score on some ridiculous plays. Michigan fumbled on the 1 yard line, things like that. When you saw the game, were there any major takeaways that you want to bring forward from the TCU side?
I mean, there were pretty egregious errors on both sides of the game here. Post-game win expectancy, TCU 67.5%. So by no means a robbery. They were the right team, deserved to win the matchup. But I mean, these teams getting cute at this point in the season, just baffling to me. Michigan, everybody knows at this point, putting Khalil Mullings in on the 1 yard line instead of Donovan Edwards. Donovan Edwards, a premier All-American caliber back. Now he plays with Blake Corum, so he doesn't necessarily receive the workload to actually put up those counting stats. But you take a guy who's previously played running back, he's been playing defense most of the year, and you run a fullback dive with him. Those kind of you just can't make excuses for those kind of plays. But like TCU had plenty of those plays as well. Darius Davis almost single-handedly lost TCU the game on multiple occasions. Gets a perfect ball thrown his direction for Max Duggan, and instead of catching it, he just volleyball sets it into the air, right into the hands of the safeties behind him. So it's not just Michigan. That 1 yard line play was egregious, but TCU had a bunch of egregious plays themselves. And luckily they were able to get away with a win here despite some of the errors. But that game was really messy.
Super sloppy. You mentioned some of those plays. It looked like Michigan was going to rally back. They hit the flea flicker. Kendre Miller went down. Demarc stepped up. He looked great. Obviously, they showed they can score with everybody and then some. And Michigan's defense, we could do a whole show on maybe why Hawaii and Colorado State don't get you ready for competent offenses. But I want to ask you about the other game as well. Georgia had to battle back. They took multiple haymakers. Stetson Bennett stayed in it. They answered late. Ohio State, Stroud, I think the one thing Georgia's defense truly wasn't prepared for was Stroud using his legs. That's something he doesn't really do, and it definitely screwed them up defensively at times. What did you make from Georgia? They're the champs, and they did find a way to survive.
Yeah, interestingly enough, Ohio State only 36% post-game win expectancy. Wow. So you'll hear this narrative that Ohio State should have won the game. Based on what actually happened on the field, that's not true. I mean, maybe if they put their foot on the gas when they had the lead, they could have extended it, and this post-game win expectancy doesn't even get to this point. But ultimately, I do think the rightful team won. The average margin of victory here is actually -3, so Georgia kept the game a little closer than they should have, just speaking to some errors they made on their side. But my biggest takeaway in this game was Georgia showing more cracks on defense. This is, by all accounts, one of the better defenses in the country. but their level of competition hasn't exactly been, Alabama's level of competition. I don't even know if it's been TCU's. This team is playing in the SEC East. They had their week 1 game against Oregon, who moved the ball well on them, but Bo Nix threw some untimely interceptions. Then they played Samford, early season South Carolina, who was a corpse, Kent State, corpse, Missouri, no quarterback, Auburn, no quarterback, Vanderbilt, no quarterback, Florida, no quarterback, beat Tennessee, that's awesome. Mississippi State, they run this anemic, throw the ball 5 yards and fall down every single play. Kentucky, no quarterback. Georgia Tech, no quarterback. LSU, Jaden Daniels gets hurt in the game. They still give up 30 points. Like, I don't know who Georgia's really played this year that's any good. So, I mean, for Ohio State to actually display the ability to take advantage of this defense, I think is one of the key takeaways, because out of all the offenses we've named, you have Tennessee and you have Oregon, who are maybe the only teams who could have exploited this Georgia defense. Like, I have no confidence in Kent State or the Auburn quarterbacks, Vanderbilt. Like, Anthony Richardson for Florida is definitely not exploiting this Georgia defense. So seeing competent quarterback play actually display the cracks in this Georgia defense, I think, is the biggest takeaway here, because TCU is definitely going to bring it on offense. And can Georgia stop it? I mean, there's questions there for me.
That is the $1 million question. That is something, again, I'm not going to rip on Georgia, but part of the reason, and you can check the tape, and it's cost me money. It is not like I get credit for it. I thought that Ohio State could hang in because Georgia's schedule and that Tennessee game, that was such a perfect spot. They were at home, like a really difficult spot for Tennessee to answer the challenge there. Oregon was in the opening game. I just thought situationally, this Georgia defense had some luxuries that masked. They're still a great defense, but are they historic level good? I think the answer to that is clearly no. And TCU is going to do some things that no opponent has caused some problems that Georgia simply hasn't seen. Let's get into this game. Before I do, though, I want to get this out early in the show. Sometimes I wait and I tease it and I say, I'm going to tell you a way to make some money on your money. I get to it right now. If you don't play at DraftKings, you still have time before the national championship to turn $5 into $200 by taking 2 minutes out of your day. You go to the link in the description of this video. You click it. You sign up. You know how to sign up. You enter your info. You link your thing. You throw in $5. You take it. Put it on TCU. Live a little, because it doesn't matter. It does not matter. Win or lose. 5 into 200 in free bets. It's that simple. It's instant. It takes 2 seconds. And you're going to have $200 to play with no matter what sports you like to bet. So do that now. I know a lot of you have already done it. I know a lot of you have said, I'm going to do this. And then you wait like me. You delay and push it off. Take 2 minutes. Get your $200 and have a more opportunities in this national championship game, because we got 1 million bets on the docket. It's sitting at 12.5 right now. It's sitting at 62.5. Let's start to get into the teams. We can start with TCU. They obviously are the underdog. We've got some player props as well on their side. When you look at them, you've already talked about some of it, but how do you think they go about taking their best shot against the champs?
Yeah, I think part of it is just Georgia has shown cracks on defense, and I think a lot of them come via the pass. Now, it's tough to evaluate this because, week one, I'll talk about the good quarterbacks they faced. So they beat Oregon 49-3. Bo Nix actually moved the ball really well in this defense. That's something we talked about early in the season when we handicapped Georgia. It's just, like every time they got into the red zone, oh, here's good old pick six. Bo Nix throws an interception. So, I mean, the 3 points that Oregon put up in that game isn't really indicative of how well they moved the ball. And then they got themselves in such a hole, they just couldn't climb out of it. And then against Tennessee, I can't take anything away from this Georgia defense for that game. The only real factor I think that might have limited Tennessee is you had Cedric Tillman playing through an injury. But I mean, we're still talking about limiting Jalen Hyatt and Brew McCoy and Hendon Hooker. So that is certainly something that needs to be applauded for Georgia. But then this most recent game against Ohio State, and it's tough because, Ohio State is the best receiving room in the country. They have maybe a top 3 signal caller in the country. So, yeah, they're going to dissect most teams offensively. And Marvin Harrison and Emeka Ibuka certainly did that. My question for TCU is, how close are they to that Ohio State offense? And I think this is probably, outside of maybe Tennessee, the second best offense this Georgia team will have faced all year. You have dynamic playmakers in Max Duggan, Kendre Miller. If he plays, that's one of the biggest storylines for TCU. But then this is a unique offense that Georgia hasn't really seen a lot. This team's going to spread you 4 wide most of the time, and they're going to create unique mismatches. They have 2 outside receivers in Quentin Johnson and Savion Williams, who are both at least 6'4". The tallest Georgia corner is 6'1". That's a mismatch. And then just the fact that they're going to force 4 DBs onto the field most of the time. Who's covering the slot? Because you're also going to have Tay Barber and Darius Davis. This is a unique formation that Georgia hasn't seen a lot this year. I'm looking at their schedule, and the only team that has done this to them is Mississippi State. And we know Mississippi State runs a neutered version of this where Will Rogers can't move whatsoever. So he just immediately throws the ball, screens, and the receivers fall down. Well, that's not what TCU is going to do. And Duggan has the mobility to take advantage of running lanes that maybe a guy like Will Rogers didn't. So that is the biggest thing with TCU. Then on the other side, I think the biggest mismatch in the whole game is Georgia up front and what they're going to do to this TCU defensive line. This TCU defensive line has held up through most of Big 12 play, but they've definitely been cooked on a couple occasions. And this TCU defensive line ranks 95th in the country in contact at or behind the line of scrimmage on run plays. So they're not generating a huge push. It's one of the better offensive line units they faced all year. And Georgia has a slew of running backs, not to mention this team's in 12 personnel most of the time. So Georgia should be able to run at will on TCU. Can TCU keep up with those receivers, I think, is the biggest question in the game. But did you notice any mismatches?
Certainly. The one that stood out the most was Georgia's front against TCU's front. But I want to kind of go. It was such a crazy game. Did you expect more from Michigan, who has the best O-line in the country? They won the Joe Moore Award. Did you think that they would be able to run more at will? Or do you think, again, it was just the miscues that really stifled those drives, and ultimately they were able to run very effectively?
Yeah, this team ran pretty well themselves. Like, they averaged over 5 yards per carry on the ground. Like, they were effective on the ground. It's just when they got into scoring position, you use Khalil Mullings and you run these weird, they try to run like a Philly special type play. Which
that was,
it didn't even look like JJ McCarthy was running a route. Like, I don't know if he was,
what that was.
I don't know what it was either. It's hard. I can't even evaluate it because I don't know what the goal was. I don't know what they were trying to do. So it just seemed like Michigan has all the success in the world moving the ball down the field. And then when it's time to actually punch it in, they get cute and limit themselves. I think Michigan easily could have won that game. They had a ton of success up front. Now, I think they're probably a slightly better rushing attack than Georgia, but the question is, how big is the difference, and does that difference matter? Because if you're averaging 5 yards a carry a crack, you don't even really need to put the ball in the air. And if Georgia is playing with a lead, I don't really see them doing that. I don't think they need to.
We'll get to Georgia's playmakers in a second. I want to ask you specifically about some of the TCU guys, whether it's player props or just in general. First thing, you mentioned Kendre Miller. If he does not play, how big of a deal do you think that is?
I think it's a pretty big deal. A lot of people were surprised by Amari DeMarcado, which makes sense. He's kind of a career change of pace back. He's been efficient in small samples, but Kendre Miller certainly has shown an efficiency gap between the two. Kendre Miller averaged nearly 100 yards rushing per game on 17 carries. It's incredibly efficient. He's a good pass catcher, but I don't know if the drop off to DeMarcado is that massive. The question to me is, when you look at how this Georgia defense is composed, they're 10th in run D. So and the names on the defensive line. Jalen Carter highlights it, but they have a number of very good defenders up front. And I think their front seven is the strength of the defense. My question heading into this game is, should TCU be running the ball anyway with DeMarcado, with Kendre Miller, whoever it is? I think the way TCU stays in this game is through the air. Georgia 39th in coverage. That's pretty good. But again, we mentioned a lot of the quarterbacks they faced this year. That doesn't necessarily scare me. And then they do have advantages. Again, they have the offensive 4 wide component, which is going to create stresses to the Georgia defense with playmakers that typically aren't on the field covering the way they're going to have to. You have size mismatches, particularly on the perimeter with Quentin Johnson and Savion Williams, 6'4" and 6'5". The Georgia corners are going to be ceding 3 to 4 inches of height, depending on the mismatch they try to go out there and play. And then you have Duggan's mobility, which that's not something we've really seen Georgia face this year either. And when we have, they've gotten cooked by a couple of these guys. Most recently, Stroud, who isn't the most mobile, but Jaden Daniels was having some success prior to the injury. They have limited a few too, though. We still need to talk about Hendon Hooker and Brady Cook and some of the likes in the SEC. So that's not a slam dunk matchup. But I think if TCU wants to win this game, it doesn't really come through Kendre Miller. I think it comes through the pass game.
Favorite player props from the TCU side. You've got a guy like Max Dugan. If you want to look at his rushing yards, it's sitting around 31. The receivers on the outside, you've got Johnson almost at 90. You've got Tay Barber and those guys in the more methodical 35 to 40 range. Is there anyone that jumped out for you over on the player prop side for this game?
For TCU, my favorite one is Quentin Johnson under 88.5 receiving yards. When you look at him on the season, this is kind of a scary fade. He has a 23% target share. That's mostly because he played a lot of games through injury. He averaged 82 yards per game. And again, he played through injury. So it's kind of a scary fade. But when you look at the total in the game, it's 63 points. That's healthy. TCU's implied team total is just north of 25. And if you look at Dugan's props, he's sitting around 230. So, I mean, we're talking about 1/3 of the receiving yards going to one player. Right away, mathematically, that doesn't make a lot of sense unless Quentin Johnson just has one of these absolute monster 15 target games, which is in his range of outcomes. But these are few and far between. He actually has two games this year with double-digit targets all season long, just 2 games. And again, he did get hurt towards the end of the season, but he played half the season fully healthy, to my knowledge. Again, we'll never know what goes on with these players behind the scenes. But 2 games and double-digit targets is pretty concerning here. So that the 2-game stretch we're talking about in the middle of the season, he had 17 and 14 targets. I really think you're just fading that. And as long as he doesn't see that massive target share, you're looking pretty good towards the under here. Not to mention, this could be a little inflated after last week's performance. His long touchdown, he essentially was untouched because the Michigan defender fell down. So, I mean, that's another fluky play that kind of worked in favor of TCU. But Quentin Johnson's touchdown, he was just literally untouched for like 15 yards because of a fallen defender.
They had to zoom out. There was nobody. I mean, he was just running down the sidelines completely free. Don't see that happening against Georgia. You mentioned the scary fade. That's super interesting. If you would have asked me how many games, double-digit targets for a guy like that, I would have honestly assumed the majority of their games that he got there, and that just shows not really the case. And he wasn't, again, to my knowledge either. He was healthy at the beginning of the year. He had ample opportunities, and they just kind of, distributed the ball to numerous guys. So I get it. Anything else on the TCU side before we talk about Georgia?
I don't think so. Was there anything that piqued your attention on TCU?
Not really. I think the Duggan line is about right in both iterations. I have no interest in his passing yards. Rushing, it's just tough because there's definitely, and we've seen this, there are scenarios where he takes a bunch of sacks. Like if he stays upright, yeah, he's going to have his timely scrambles. But if Georgia gets to him 3, 4, 5 times, he could finish with negative rushing yards. So I don't really have much to say there. I'm going to keep an eye on the backfield. I wouldn't really have interest in those props anyway, but a little more information couldn't hurt. I have more interest on the Georgia side, to be honest.
Me too. I know some of you guys treat this game like the Super Bowl, so I'll name a few that have a little less value, but if you're going to play like 12 props or something, I would rank Quentin Johnson's under by far number 1, and these next 2 would be deeper plays. First of all, we don't have props on the TCU backfield because Kendre Miller's questionable, and he is a legit questionable here. He tried to come back in the second half, carried the ball once, and then had to leave the game for the rest of the game. So I don't know if we'll see him, and then you have to wonder to what capacity he plays. You could very much have a Blake Corum situation where he tries to play the game, 2 carries, boom, he's out. So I don't think you'll get rushing props for TCU. But Tay Barber and Darius Davis both do have props. These are the slot receivers. And again, they're running 4 wide. So receivers as in plural. I think Darius Davis under 27.5 is interesting. Not a good value. But where I want to look is Tay Barber. He's the other slot receiver. And with Darius Davis playing so bad in that semifinal, I think you might see extra opportunity for Tay Barber. That actually did happen in the semifinal too. You had more routes for Tay Barber, more snaps, and he's the more reliable receiver at this point. Not to mention, more efficient. You look at yards per game, yards per route run. Tay Barber's working slightly ahead of Davis. Their props are almost the same. I see 33.5 on Barber. There's a little bit of value towards the over. On the back end in our projections, he comes in at 40 on the dot. So if it's anything north of 33.5, I'm not sure I'd take it. But at 33.5, it is a slight value towards the over. But that's it for TCU.
Yeah, and definitely, again, oddchopper.com. You can shop these. More props are going to pop up as we get closer to Monday. We're filming this earlier, or I should say late in the previous week. So keep an eye on that. Where are you going to get these props when they pop up? Insider access, aka our Discord. Me, Matt, and the whole team, we're in there throughout the week. We'll be dropping information. You can sign up for free, 100% free for a week. Just click the link in the description of this video. You hop in there. When we get word on Kendre Miller, when we get word on some of these places, whether it's Prize Picks or anything else, that's where you want to be. Great opportunity and plenty of plays right there. Let's talk about the Dogs. Like I said, it wasn't pretty, but they're the defending national champs, and they're going for 2 straight, which we don't see that often. I mean, pretty impressive stuff from Georgia. Obviously, Kirby gave the standard. We're going to have to play a whole lot better, blah, blah, blah. Let's start with Stetson Bennett. What did you think? His props are obviously much higher. Not much higher, but he's in the 270 range for passing yards. Got double-digit rushing yard props, just sitting like 10, 11 and a half. Do you think that he needs to have a big game against TCU? Do you think that it might just be a really ground-heavy attack? How do you think Georgia plays this?
I don't think it's necessary for him to have a big game, but I think it kind of depends on the looks TCU shows you. If TCU is selling out to stop the run and adding extra defenders in the box because they've been bullied by other teams, then Stetson Bennett needs to win with his arm. But if TCU kind of plays it like they've been playing all season long, then I think maybe you do see the run game succeed here. But, I have a lot of questions. TCU's kind of morph their game plans to different teams. Like Michigan gashed them on the ground. They just shot themselves in the foot. But like this team held Bijan Robinson in check, which was huge. Like Bijan's not playing behind the Georgia offensive line. Texas actually had a really up and down offensive line, which made sense. They were super young. They're going to be very good in the future. But Bijan was creating a lot on his own, but TCU was able to stop him. And Texas did not have the quarterback to take advantage of them through the secondary, so they could dedicate extra resources to stopping Bijan. Does that happen against Georgia? And does Georgia end up like Quinn Ewers, or do they end up like J.J. McCarthy in Michigan before the errors near the goal line? I tend to think it's more towards the latter. So with Stetson's prop, I'm showing a slight value towards the over. He's projected in the 280s for us. But again, I don't think that's enough to bet. And this kind of comes down to however Georgia want to place it. Just mathematically, he's going to project in the high 270s, low 280s, because Georgia's implied for 38 points. When you score 38 points, you're probably going to be close to 300 passing yards regardless. But do they take a really run-heavy approach? What does TCU give them? I think there's a lot of risk in Stetson's props himself, and I would rather target the rushers here, both of whom I think are pretty decent values. What do you think?
I definitely think that there's a very real range of outcomes where Georgia just leans on the run game, keeps the ball out of TCU's hands, doesn't make mistakes like Michigan did, and that's the catalyst. And Stetson Bennett goes back to being a very solid game manager. He doesn't lose the game, and he's fine. I guess for me, though, on the outside, say the game does devolve. Say they do need to score 40 to win the game. Stetson Bennett's going to have to throw, and I think he'll be effective if he needs to be. My bigger question is, where does it go? The guy I have my on is Donnie Mitchell. His prop is sitting at 34.5. I lean over there. I think that he's in line for a big game. We know about Bowers. I want to ask you about the status of Ladd, though, on the outside. Georgia's got a lot of bodies out there. Is that something that you want to see clarification on? Does it matter? A couple other guys, I believe. Who's the other big-time tight end on Georgia? Washington?
Darnell Washington.
Is he all right? It looked like he was banged up at one point.
Yeah, I mean, he was on crutches in the second half.
That can't be good. I mean, again, are these personnel losses huge for the props, or Bowers and Mitchell and some of these guys in play regardless of the status of these other ones?
All right, so to break, I do agree with you on AD Mitchell, and there's a lot of reasons why. We'll start with the injuries. These definitely work in his favor. I don't have his prop up on my end, but you do. What is it, Ben?
It's at so AD Mitchell's at 34.5. You can get that at several books. I'm on OddsShopper right now.
Yeah, I'm in Wisconsin, this state.
Sons of bitches.
So I don't have them all, but as soon as AD Mitchell pops, I will be hitting the over on him. So for context, Ladd McConkey sprained his knee in the SEC championship. He had a month off, and he had to exit the playoff semifinal with the same injury. Now, it seems to be more of a maintenance issue, but holy smokes, did he look bad and hurt out there. 4 targets turned it into 2 catches for negative receiving yards. So clearly limited. And then not to mention his route rate down in the 60%. Like, he just flat out had to leave the game. Now you're talking about just 1 week's rest. Like, it's the national championship. I very much think Ladd McConkey plays in this game, but to what capacity? Then the tight end, Darnell Washington, he left the game with an ankle sprain in the first half, was in a boot and on crutches. Now, this is hard to evaluate because a lot of times, even minor lower body injuries, people will put the boot on just as a precaution. We saw that with Jaden Daniels a couple times this year for LSU, where he tweaked his ankle. He was in the boot on Monday, and then boom, full go practices, ends up running for like 100 yards in the LSU games. All the rhetoric coming out of Georgia is that he's going to play in this game as well. But my question again is, to what capacity? With all this said, I'm not sure it matters for the AD Mitchell prop anyway. These are just kind of feathers in his cap. He already saw his routes jump from 30% up to 76% in this game, saw 6 targets in the game. He just flat out took Marcus Rosemy-Jack Saint's job. And that was with McConkey participating in 60% of routes, Darnell Washington before he went out too. And he played particularly on the perimeter. Like, when Darnell comes out of the game, that basically means now they're using a slot receiver instead of 2 tight ends. It doesn't even affect AD Mitchell. So he projects towards the over with these guys in. Now, if you get the fact that McConkey might be injured, Darnell might be injured, or maybe they play and they're less than 100%, those also work towards the over. So I think you're immediately starting with value here, and there's only outs towards the over. There's very little risk to the under in this. And the only risk is that Georgia runs the ball 50, 60 times in a routing, but they're still going to have to pass to some degree here. And AD Mitchell, outside of Brock Bowers, is by far the favorite target. And the Brock Bowers situation was weird, just to touch on this. I think there might be some slight value towards his over. You're going to find these in the low 60s. Maybe you could find a 60.5 receiving yards. But people were very, very upset online about the lack of involvement for Bowers in the playoff semifinal. Well, it came out during the game or maybe after the game that Bowers was playing through an illness. So, I only think Bowers' role probably increases here, especially with Darnell hurt. He should have another week to not be sick. That should only help Bowers, but he's projected pretty efficiently, I think.
Yeah, I see 61.5 out there. I am interested. I don't think this really matters per se. I will say TCU does have Hodges Tomlinson, someone I really do respect. I'm interested in what they do with him. Do they try to put him on like a Bowers? I don't know if you can even do that. Where they stick him on Mitchell. We'll see. But overall, I couldn't agree more that even if Georgia employs a run-heavy attack, you still have outs. If they have to pass a lot, I don't know how these guys don't go over, just given some of the limitations elsewhere. And then again, the backfield is the backfield. And let's talk about that right now. You've got Edwards, you've got McIntosh. I see 49.5 and in the 60s for McIntosh. Can you go over on both? Do you like one more than the other? It seems clear that Georgia's front has the advantage.
Yeah, I like the overs on both. I actually like McIntosh a little more than Edwards. They sort of showed that they're willing to play a lot of McIntosh when the chips are down and they absolutely need to play. Last week, they did that. And this is a little noisy because they were trailing in the beginning, but 37 snaps for McIntosh, 15 for Edwards, only 10 for Kendall Milton. So that suggests to me that when they need a back, McIntosh is the guy they're going to look to. Now, the carries were still lopsided. You had 8 for Edwards, 5 for McIntosh. I also think that's a little noisy because every time McIntosh touched the ball, it was like a 50-yard gain. So to some degree, we saw this with Kendry Millard a couple times this year where, he finishes with 12 carries for 100 yards. Yeah, when you're scoring in 3 plays, you're not going to just load up on the opportunity statistics. And sometimes that doesn't matter if you're hyper efficient. Say they have reduced efficiency here. If he still plays 37 snaps, I think Kenny McIntosh is probably towards your 12, maybe 15 carries in the game. And Edwards could be in that range too. You know, the SEC championship, McIntosh had 14 carries, Edwards had 12. And that wasn't necessarily a close game. So you still had Kendall Milton with 8 and Branson Robinson with 5. Well, in that close game against Ohio State, Branson Robinson didn't even play a snap. Kendall Milton only played 10. So if TCU keeps this even remotely close to the spread, I think you're mostly seeing McIntosh and Edwards, with McIntosh getting a bump here due to the nature of this game. This is the most competitive game for these Georgia players of their career. So I think both are overs. And I think the better one is Kenny McIntosh if you're just playing one of them.
Final thoughts for Georgia. Anything else that you want to mention before we got to give a prediction before we get out of here, of course. But any final player props or any personnel things for Georgia?
I think for player personnel, we mostly so I think there's one thing Georgia is going to try to do with the 2 tight ends. TCU's actually been really good at defending tight ends this year, and they just played this dual tight end attack with Michigan, who used Schoonmaker and Colston Loveland. Schoonmaker got hurt in the game, unfortunately, but Loveland only caught 3 of 8 targets for 37 yards. The TCU defense had 2 pass breakups and an interception on Loveland targets. They defended Ben Sinnott pretty well in the Big 12 championship. He did have a touchdown, but only 2 of 3 targets. One of them was a pass breakup. They defended Jatavian Sanders for Texas pretty well. He caught 7 of 12 targets, but for 61 yards, they had 3 pass breakups on him. Every time Sanders caught the ball, it was basically at the line of scrimmage, and then he fell down. And most of the other Big 12 offenses don't really use a tight end. You got a lot of teams like Kansas and Oklahoma State, where either they're not a focal point or they're just not on the field. But in the small sample where TCU did defend dual tight ends, they did do a good job. The question is, you know, Brock Bowers and Darnell Washington are unlike any other tight end tandem in the entire country. So it's still a question. And then I just want to know what TCU does with their big receivers against these small Georgia defenders. One thing teams have done recently is really go after Keely Ringo for Georgia's defense. And he's played pretty well, but like I was really surprised to see how many teams are just like going right at Ringo rather than testing Kamari Laster or Javon Bullard. Javon Bullard's the slot corner for Georgia. He's going to be busy with how TCU plays. But Ohio State targeted Ringo 13 times. LSU targeted him 11 times. Georgia Tech targeted him 9. Tennessee targeted him 9. I mean, teams seem to have identified some weakness in Ringo's game. Now, he could have had a much, much worse game against Ohio State, but Marvin Harrison had 2 drops and Xavier Johnson had a drop in his targets. So 13 targets for him against Ohio State. 3 of them were drops by the receivers. He could have been absolutely decimated by this team. Does TCU's Quentin Johnston against him? How do they try to attack this seemingly weakness that other teams may have identified with Ringo? I'm not sure. So that's the biggest, I think, personnel question for me. And I think that about sums it up with the TCU defense too. For a prediction, I did take TCU plus 13. It's a lot of points for a highly competitive game when both teams have shown cracks on defense for me. Again, I think Georgia should win the game based on their massive, massive advantage mismatch here against this TCU front, which has been cooked by worse rushing attacks. But I think it's too many points.
Do you have any feel on the total?
I want to go over, but Georgia's potential game plan scares me. Georgia plays really slow to begin with. They're 114th in pace. Their pass rate's been plummeting recently. If they get a lead right away, do they just play ball control? If TCU gets a lead right away, I think that coaxes Georgia into a faster pace. But honestly, that could come down to who gets the opening kickoff and scores. So makes me nervous. I think I'm going to stay away from the total and just keep my TCU ticket at plus 13.
It's weird because normally, again, it doesn't always have to be like this, but when you're getting a pretty healthy amount of points, you know, the lower scoring game, the points become more important. But ironically here, I feel like if the game goes over the total, it helps TCU. And I feel like if the game goes under the total, it actually helps Georgia, just because I do think there are scenarios where this game is like 35-14 Georgia, and they just kind of slowly grind them up, control the tempo, control time of possession. If the game gets back and forth, out of control, score, I think that's how TCU wants to play and actually would help them. So ironically, I almost want more points because I'm going to be backing TCU as well. I missed 13. It's 12.5. I'm in no rush. I might even look live. Again, I think that you could see some things. Georgia scores first. This is going to be north of 14, and it could be a high-scoring game. So I think that's the move. I have no interest in TCU money line. Do you have any interest in that? Just want to
No, I don't. And I think you're exactly right about the pace of play. We've seen this with similar opponents this year. Does this play to the Tennessee kind of score where Georgia wins 27-13, a slower game? Or does it play like the Ohio State game, 42-41? Does it play like the LSU game, 50-30? And again, LSU scored a lot of points, and then Jaden Daniels got hurt in the game. They had to turn to Garrett Nussmeier, who actually looked a little decent himself, a gunslinger for LSU, but they still put up 30 points, and that game finished way above the total with 80 total. And I mean, the Tennessee game was at the midpoint of the year. Now the LSU and Ohio State games are stacked on top of each other. So we have a recent sample of Georgia's defense allowing production and getting into these shootouts. So if you force me to pick the total, it would be the over. I'm not going to play it. I'm just going to stick with TCU, and I'm not going to play them on the money line.
No, but it would be really cool if they won. What a year that would be for this awesome squad. I can't wait to see it again. It's Friday. We're going to have plenty more content on this channel. You're going to see me and Matt live before lock breaking down the game right before kickoff, answering any questions. We're going to get news on personnel, certainly answering all the DFS questions over on the Stochastic YouTube. So make sure you do that. One final call to get into Discord and take that 5 into 200 over on DraftKings if you're a new user. The links are in the description. At least go down there and click the links and read what you have to do, even if you don't do it. I mean, it's just such an easy thing to get a couple extra $100. We're going to bounce on out of here, friends. Thanks again, as always. Thanks to Matt for hanging out, talking some football with me. As always, for betting you, for Odd Chopper, and for ourselves. Good luck. Enjoy a great national championship. Can't wait to see it and talk about it soon enough. And, of course, stay tuned for even more content each and every day here at Odd Chopper.